Hello, everybody, and welcome again to our series of interviews with Asian experts and Asian professionals. My name is Volker Friedrich. I'm the founder and CEO of GBP International. We are a strategy and advisory company based in Malaysia. For the last 25 years, we have been operating in all of the Asian countries, mainly for European investors. And over the time, we have developed a very interesting and professional network of people and friends. And one of our friends is Tan Sri Rebecca Sta. She is the Secretary General of APEC, based in Singapore. Welcome, Rebecca. And I'm happy that we are going to share a little bit of present challenges and present topics on the international agenda with Rebecca. She just came back from Canada, now in Singapore, on the way to Thailand next week again. And Rebecca, you have been very active in the Malaysian government for many, many years. With the MITI, you have been Secretary General, you have been chairing negotiations about the free trade agreements between Malaysia, but also Europe and ASEAN has been a lot on your agenda. So before we go into our topics today, maybe you give a little introduction about APEC, because I believe our viewers here in Europe especially, they have a little bit of lack of knowledge, I like to say, and APEC is not in the news very often as an organization. Your member countries, of course, a lot. And maybe you just explain to us what APEC is all about and what the international implications of APEC are and your role as the Secretary General. Rebecca. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Volker. Thank you so much for this invitation to speak to you. Just a couple of corrections. I'm the Executive Director of APEC.
Okay, my apologies.
Yeah, no worries, no worries. And APEC is, as you can see in the background there, that's our office. It's the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation. Established in 1989, we have 21 member economies. One reason why we call ourselves economies and not countries or states, ASEAN, you call them member states. EU, I think you also say member states, right? But for APEC, it's member economies because we have with us and our members as called Hong Kong and Chinese Taipei. So for that reason, it's called economies and not countries. So that said, we are an economic organization, not political. We are non-binding. It's a voluntary body. So we do not sign agreements. Unlike ASEAN or the EU, we do not sign agreements. We have initiatives and they are voluntary. So best endeavor basis. But we've done a lot of good work in the area of trade and investment. I just want to quickly highlight a couple so that people get a perspective of what we've done. One is the environmental goods agreement at the World Trade Organization. Some years ago, the agreement on the environmental goods has its genesis in APEC. We started the conversation on environmental goods, defining what it is. And we agreed in 2012 that there will be these 54 products. So that's how it started. And in APEC, we said best endeavor to bring it down to 0 to 5% for tariffs. So now that is, and then when it was well negotiated, although we're not a negotiating body, but we agreed to that number of products. We moved it up to the WTO. So now it's a multilateral agreement. Likewise, with the trade facilitation agreement, also APEC played a very key role in moving forward the trade facilitation agreement, which is now in the WTO. So I mean, that's two simple examples when people try to figure out, you're non-binding, what do? You do sit around the table and talk, yeah, but it is done. We've done some very good work. And for the interest of folks now, because there's all this emphasis on environmental services as well. So what we're doing now, we've done the work on environmental goods. Now everyone's like, how do you define environmental services, right? So that's another area of work that is really pivotal in what we're doing now, looking at environmental services. And we hope to get a list done. And then again, the same process of getting that to the WTO for members to consider and multilateralize. So that's how we work. We call ourselves an incubator of ideas. Okay. An opportunity to get this kind of difficult conversations in an organization of 164 countries or members at the WTO, it's kind of tough to get things moving. But at APEC, we have like-minded economies, so we can have at least some of those more difficult conversations.
Right.
We're not binding, so folks would mind having those conversations. Sorry, long answer, long introduction to what APEC does.
Yeah. Right. Well, I understand, and I'd like to summarize your introduction a little bit. It's like a complementary platform for ministers and business leaders to speak kind of unofficially, inverted commas, and prepare the ground for big decisions to be made among this head of states and the ministers. And as such, it is a very important platform to generate ideas, to discuss ideas, to come up with best case studies compared to international benchmarks, etc. And since you mentioned the environmental topic in your introduction statement, I'd like to dive in a little bit, because the issue of environmental well-being, sustainability as an overall topic, of which environmental issues are a sub-context, so to say. Where is the Asian context in this global debate on sustainability? And I'm speaking from a German perspective, and COVID and Russia and Ukraine aside. Before that, we had a big movement here called Fridays for Futures. You have probably heard about that. That, of course, is now on the back burner a little bit, because the other two topics we are addressing later as well have taken over the headlines. But from my perspective, as a European businessman traveling in and out of Asia, the issue of sustainability on a broader term is not so much on the agenda in Asia Pacific. Correct me if I'm wrong. Where is the big movement that also the Asian businesses is taking that into consideration in their investment decisions, in their business planning and their growth strategies? Because we see it as a mega driver for the next decades in terms of generating new technologies, new services, etc. Where can we merge, let's say, the hype of, let's say, Europe and the, let's call it the reservation, if I may say so, to jump on that bandwagon in Asia? Do you see that in the same way as I just described it?
Let's put it in context. Very important. In 2020, when APEC was formed and established, the focus was on trade and investment. That was bread and butter for us, making it market access for goods and services, facilitating trade in that sense. What happened was in 2020, we had what we called in 1994 the BOGO goals. The BOGO goals was about free trade and investment by 2020. So when we were heading to 2020, that was a question that, what do we do next? What is the next phase for economic integration in the region? And that's when we came up with the vision for APEC. And the vision for APEC going forward, so that set the stage for us. So 2020, the leaders launched this new vision. And very important, I want to draw your attention to three key drivers. This vision has three key drivers. Trade and investment, and that's because it's your bread and butter.
Right.
The second driver, economic driver, is innovation and digitalization. The third driver is what we are referring to, is sustainable, balanced, inclusive growth for the region, economic growth. So the conversation around sustainability and inclusive growth is now front and center, as it were. There's a lot of discussions on this. And this year, Thailand, as host of APEC, is putting a bigger emphasis on and a lot more focus on sustainable and inclusive growth. So the Thais have every chair of APEC, because APEC has a chair that rotates, but it's not like ASEAN. ASEAN, it's by alphabetical order, right? APEC is voluntary, so whoever offers to host. So this year, Thailand has offered to host. So all the meetings will take place in Thailand.
Okay.
So now Thailand has put the biocircular economy as upfront. That will be a key discussion around sustainable development. So focusing on different aspects of sustainable development. So for example, we have the energy working group in APEC. So the energy working group will be looking at renewables. It's been on our plate for the longest time, I must say, sustainable development. But now it is with the new vision, there is increased focus. So, if you said that it wasn't quite on our radar, no, it has been on our radar, but it is more, it's now more focused.
Okay.
So that's the thing.
Yeah.
And in Thailand has decided this is it. We have to be very, very clear about what we do, given all our respective commitments at COP26. How do we translate all this into something more concrete for us? So that's why you will see this year some work being done on environmental services.
Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong. I'm not blaming anything. Also here in Germany, it took like 50 years, before we are where we are now, with the Green Party and being part of the government, pushing for all this CO2 reduction and increasing cost of petrol and you name it. So it's a process which takes time, and I'm glad to hear that also this process is being accelerated now with putting it higher on the agenda. But of course, if we look at the broader economies, it's still about getting people to work, make sure people have a decent income to live, and at the same time try to raise, let's say, living standards and the quality of life in general, modern, let's say, conditions at work or in the factory. And one topic you also mentioned, now you are traveling again to Thailand. Of course, people who are looking at Asia, they have been restricted from traveling because of COVID. Now we see a little bit of easing. China aside, China is having a different policy, as we know, with the strict lockdowns. What is your perception at the moment? Where are we heading towards the post-COVID time? Do you see a continuation of relaxation, or are you worried that we may get back to where we were a few months ago?
One of let me just take a couple of steps back. APEC functions it's not just the body of civil servants or policymakers. We have as key partners for APEC is the APEC Business Advisory Council. So you've got that business component, and we engage directly with the business community through the APEC Business Advisory Council. Now, right from the get-go, the Business Advisory Council has been talking to us and saying, how do we manage in this environment of COVID? What can we do as a body to ensure that, we facilitate business despite the movement, the controls and all the restrictions? So we have had a lot of focus on what can we do. So this year, there is this very important conversation going on safe passage, and we figured this is something that we need to do, not because of COVID, but you never know what will happen again in future. So you need to have some guidelines, some way of dealing with this. How do you ensure that the restrictions on cross-border travel, is managed more in a more cohesive way among APEC members? So now that borders are opening, it seems, everything is opening up, we can forget about, safe passage. But I think that conversation needs to continue, because we need to get to the finer details. And that's exactly what we are doing in APEC. There's the Safe Passage Task Force working. The thing is, you must pool resources quickly to get things discussed and move forward. So we brought in the international bodies. The last thing we want is to duplicate, right? So we brought in IATA, ACIO, the business community, WHO, and had that conversation. We also track what EU is doing, how EU is managing the travel of businesses.
Right.
And so we found that in our region, one area that we need to really focus more clearly is to make it easier so that you don't get so many questions when people are traveling. One is the certificates, the question around the vaccine certificates. Yes, we don't need pre-test and post-test now, but when you check in, they'll still ask you, have you been vaccinated, right? So you have to show proof of your vaccination. So the thing is, the question around vaccine certs, cases, of fraudulent cases, of fraud certificates, interoperability of some of the QR codes, for example, so there are things that we need to really simplify and focus on. It's not that now everything's back to normal, we can just move on. No, we really need to get this sorted out, because in the event, you never know. So at least you know this is what needs to be done. So that's going to be key. We are looking at a portal, where we can share information freely. So if you want to travel to the US, you want to go to China, you want to go to Papua New Guinea, you don't have to crack your head where to go and look for those details. So we want to make sure we have it in one place. Facilitating business is always important. And we're doing this together with the Business Advisory Council, as I said.
Okay, that's very good. Yeah, I mean, even though I believe the people I speak to, they just wish for, let's go back to pre-COVID, that like you just outlined, it's a role of an organization like yours to prepare what happens if we have a second round of COVID coming or new variant or whatever. So I applaud these actions and let's say your work in preparing for the future. That also leads me to another discussion item I have put on my agenda. You mentioned QR code, digital pass, etc. The topic of, let's say, digitalization brings me to the use and the education. And where I see, or where I realize a gap is in terms of the digitalization, artificial intelligence, etc., industry 4.0. Again, I see the different world in Europe, where we have, in Germany, for example, we talk first and foremost about data protection before we talk about innovation. And I feel in Asia, it's the other way around. We see a lot of usage by the young generation, much more than we do here. What is your perception on that one? Is this let's say, the area of the economy where Asia is now more advanced than, let's say, Europe, for example, or is that just my individual perception?
I always say that if there's nothing else that we have learned from COVID, it's how to pivot very quickly into the digital environment. And we've seen it. And we've in APEC in 2017, we set up this body called the Digital Economy Steering Group, because even then we figured that there's a lot that we need to do with the IoT, as you said, the fourth industrial revolution. So how do we have a more cohesive approach to the digital economy? So we established a body, and we've got experts, working with us on what are the issues that you need to deal with when you talk of the digital economy. There's the infrastructure issue, there's the policy issues. Narrowing the digital gap is one thing that we've been discussing, and it became very, very evident when COVID hit and people were working from home, children were having to have studies at schooling from home. It became so clear.
I can tell you stories what happened here in Germany. You wouldn't believe.
So there's so much of this, and we've always talked about e-commerce. Every time we talk about digitalization, the focus was on e-commerce, but it became clearer to us, and that's when we set up the Digital Economy Steering Group. We have in APEC, the APEC Internet and Digital Economy Roadmap. This was some years ago. So, and there are aspects of it that we want to implement, and we track and we help. One of the key areas one of the key strengths rather of APEC is our ability to share best practice and technical cooperation and capacity building. So a key way of working for us is our ecotech. We have funds, member economies put in funds so that folks can tap into those funds to build capacity for policymakers, for the different economies to come up to speed. So this is one area. So we've figured that getting all of us to that stage where it is not just about facilitating e-commerce, but being more inclusive. This became evident during COVID when you had businesses were from the interior, for example. You're familiar with Malaysia, interior of Sabah. How do they get their products out? How do they get their products online when you don't have broadband? How do children go to school and have classes when you don't have broadband access? So the whole idea of infrastructure, of rules that would facilitate the quick, adoption of technology it has been key, and I'm glad that we started this conversation in APEC some years ago. And so now it seems like, oh gosh, thank God we did that,
Yeah, exactly. I tell to my friends, imagine how severe COVID would have been if we wouldn't have had the internet, you know. Now
Absolutely.
the business are striving with Zoom conferences like we do now.
Yeah.
But the perception here sometimes is, well, I can send an email and I know how to use WhatsApp, so I'm a digital native already. Yeah, so there's a lot to catch up and much more to do.
When COVID struck, it was Malaysia's year, and we were planning at that time to have, we're working on the new vision, right? And APEC has always been a face-to-face environment. And when Malaysia's year of COVID hit, we had to quickly pivot to the virtual environment. So we had to learn how to manage, all these virtual meetings. But that was 2020, right? And in August 2020, very important, August 2020, New Zealand who would take over after Malaysia as host of APEC. In August of 2020, they approached me and said, in 2021, we are going to be completely virtual. I think, like, why? This is crazy. I mean, you're preempting it so far ahead, but they decided and they said, this is it. So they refined the technical aspects so that we could have all our meetings online for the whole year. And it went very well. I mean, for me, you still miss that face-to-face and some of the more important discussions.
Of course, yeah.
But it still served a purpose. We still managed to get things done.
Yeah, that's right. No, definitely. But still, much more work needs to be done on all fronts there. But it's on the right track. And I'm surprised that businesses, generally speaking, are still thriving so reasonably well, despite all the COVID restrictions and the supply chain challenges we have. That brings me to another topic where I believe you are very much an insider, and I really look forward to your opinion on the topic of, we call it deglobalization versus globalization. And we are all well aware of the discussion with US-China trade conflict we have had under Trump. Now we have a more inward-looking policy in China, especially China being the largest trading partners for most countries, including Germany and Europe. And there's a lot of talk about decoupling issues and don't put all your eggs in one basket. China is too big. On top of that, we have the controversy on the political approach of China versus Russia. So where do you see all this going? Is the age of globalization over, to put the question a bit provocative?
There are articles that are coming out now, right, on the whole idea of decoupling, deglobalization. But at the end of the day, it's about still some of these issues cannot be resolved by focusing on yourself, an internal focus. Trade is a multilateral initiative. It's multilateral endeavor, and it is not a zero-sum game. Folks will always say, "Oh, it's about protecting my market." No, it's not a zero-sum game. It doesn't mean that exports are good, imports are bad. I mean, when you think about it, it is mutually beneficial. It is, if you look and turn inwards, onshoring as opposed to offshore outsourcing, supply chains are already being disrupted. It is not about bringing back the manufacturing processes, but it's about strengthening your supply chains. It's about rethinking, we used to be so comfortable and look at just in time. Maybe those are things that we need to focus on. Looking again at how to make your supply chains more resilient, more diversified, as opposed to focusing, the supply chains are so skewed to one or two, areas or economies that because of those disruptions, your whole thing goes. It's about really looking at strengthening supply chains, your resilience, your diversification, even, if you want to look at it that way. But really putting a better focus and understand that trade is not a zero-sum game. Imports are not necessarily bad. The business knows this, but the politicians, the civil society, they take a completely different view. I experienced it when we were negotiating TPP, for example. There's a big story. Oh, imports are already going up. Look at our numbers. The numbers are going up. And one group drew my attention to the fact that our imports. See, we are so married to the idea of imports good only if it's intermediate, not final product. So we this person raised this issue at an open forum saying, look, your imports of finished goods are going up. So I said, give me an example. So they said, look at textiles and apparel. Malaysia's imports of textile and apparel went up. Oh, so it's bad, you know. So I said, we dive deeper. I said, dive deeper into what those imports were and why we had those imports suddenly. You know, it's a spike. So it came to our attention that spike was really because Uniqlo established in Malaysia. Now, Uniqlo is a big chain. So what happened when the imports came in? When Uniqlo invested in Malaysia, you know, set up stores, what happened? You had stores opening, you had employment, you had logistics chain getting involved. So, you know, just to focus on goods is so
very narrow, yeah.
Yes. So, you know, trade is not just about goods, it's also about services. So thinking of it in that perspective, then, you know, deglobalization, no, it doesn't work that way. You know, you cannot scale. You can't scale.
I share your view 100%. I believe we are both economists. We all have read and heard about David Ricardo 250 years ago.
Absolutely.
The comparative cost advantage of international trade. So, and there's no better theory yet. But on the other hand, I think it's common sense of any reasonable business person to say, I don't want to be dependent on one supplier or one customer only. So it's a very natural behavior to rethink and, like you say, strengthen your supply and customer chain. So, and I think it will continue. And the international trade is so much interlinked and so many layers of partners. I think decoupling is very irrational, if I may say so. And I understand, on the other hand, the political agenda behind it. You know, we need an enemy, we have to fight, and we are getting behind our leaders and stuff like that. But that is very scary and very dangerous as well. All right. Okay. In our final chapter, I'd like to bring the attention a little bit towards Europe. Europe, of course, is not a member of APEC, but you have been traveling to Europe in and out, and you are half European, so to say, with all this experience. So where do you see the European-Asian relationship going in the next couple of years? Do you have any advice or any opinion what it should be like? And you have been traveling to Brussels, you have been a negotiator on free tariff agreements, etc. What's your take on the status as we are where we are today?
You know, trade, Europe, whatever said and done, EU is, for example, in the case of Malaysia, EU is a major trading partner, you know, so that relationship is important. But one thing that I take away from the relationship that we have, whether it's ASEAN EU or Malaysia EU or APEC EU, is our common focus on things that matter, especially now when we're talking of the next generation trade and investment issues. I think in that sense, Europe was ahead. You know, in the earlier days of trade negotiations, when you wanted to put in environmental issues, for example, or labor and environment issues, there was a pushback from some of us in this region, because we say, oh, we're focusing on trade. Why you want to bring in all these other matters, right? But today you cannot have a conversation on trade without discussing environmental impacts, without discussing labor issues. And, you know, in many of our economies, we see how their suppliers, their vendors, their customers are saying, we're not doing business with you because we have doubts about how you treat the environment. We have doubts about how you treat your workers. You know,
there are very prominent example in the last couple of weeks and months, especially with Malaysia. We talk about the glove manufacturers. We talk about Dyson. Now we talk about palm oil again. You know, with Ferrero banning Sime Darby and others. So it's not trivial, and it's not a little side story. You know,
that's right, absolutely. So, you know, and we started this conversation with EU. I must say, you know, when we started negotiations with the EU some years ago, EU put this up front and center, and you know, and we had to learn. And I must say that was the impetus for us to relook our production networks, you know, and now ESG is front and center in Malaysia. The regulators, you know, for public listed companies, it's there, you have to deal with it. Finance, Bank Negara has put, you know, some regulations for green finance, you know, so and now all public listed companies must show their sustainability initiatives, right?
Yeah, that's right.
So, yeah, sustainability. So it is no more a side dish, as it were, but it's increasingly becoming real part of your main offering. So I think
it will not, and rightly so, it will not go away. You know, I mean, Europe.
So there's a lot that the EU also, in their experience, because you've done this much earlier, that we can learn through your own experience, how you manage your vendors, how you manage your value chains to ensure that this is embedded and it's not just about your production, but all the folks who supply to you. You may be very good, you may have governance and everything up to speed, but your supplier. So I think the Dyson example clearly drove home the point that it's not just about my product, but what comes into the inputs that come into my production is equally important. I think those are important lessons that we can learn from how you are managing, your businesses, how you're looking at renewables, what you're doing for the circular economy. This is now becoming prominent in this region, but clearly EU has been doing it for some years now.
Yeah, but I see already. I mean, it all has to be supported by common sense. You know, we all want to have better worker conditions. We all want to have a cleaner environment. But I see a large disruption coming along. You know, because if we want to implement it, if we want to force companies to raise their standards, automatically their cost of production will go up.
Absolutely.
And thus Asia will have a reduced competitive advantages. I mean, make no mistakes. Many of the investors went to Asia,
but that's
because
Volker,
of production.
Sorry,
so we have a level playing field.
But that's a short-term way of looking at things. I think at the end of the day, we also have to take a long-term view of it, and therefore we cannot avoid it. So that's one. The other point that, and I keep reminding folks, is our investment agreements must encompass these aspects to allow us to allow policymakers the space that they need to put in place the necessary environmental laws and regulations, and which may have some impact on investors. So for those economies that have older bilateral trade agreements, investment agreements, for example, with a very a strong investor-state dispute settlement, for example, that needs to be revisited. Policymakers need to review all the investment agreements so that they maintain the policy space for all these new things that are coming into place. All the environment. If I'm going to put an environmental law in place that affects your business, you can tap into that investment agreement and take me to court, right? As government. So that's why I remind policymakers that you need to go back and look at your investment agreements, your bilateral investment, your protection agreements, because of this aspect.
I cannot agree more with that, Rebecca. And I think it's all for the goods of our children and grandchildren. And short-term profit thinking for having less cost of business has to be put aside. And we all have to have a larger vision for the next 50 or 100 years, and not for the next quarter and the next shareholder meeting. And with credit to most of the companies, at least, they are also putting that into their agenda, that they cannot compromise on standards of production, whether it's in Europe, US, South America, or Asia. But again, it's a longer process. It doesn't happen overnight, and there are many, many stakeholders. Rebecca, we have covered the world headlines, so to say, in half an hour. Always interesting to talk with you, because you have such a vast experience. And there are always hundreds of thoughts coming to you at the same time. So it was very interesting. I'd like to tell our viewers basically that in preparation, and I know you personally a little bit, you have been writing a little cookbook between your retirement from the Malaysian government before you started APEC. So why don't you share your favorite receipt with our viewers before we say goodbye?
Yeah, thank you so much, Volker. That's my labor of love. After I retired, I decided, with my daughter overseas, my brother overseas, my nieces and nephews traveling, they all want a special taste of home. And also that's so to facilitate their cooking when they miss home. The other is I wanted to share some stories about my grandmother, because my grandmother, my aunties, these are very strong women. And I think, you know, a very traditional Asian household, but we had very strong women. And, you know, they brought us up with the values that are so important today for us. So these are important things to remind ourselves, our children, grandchildren, for posterity. So that's why I did it.
Yeah, very good. And I think you're a very perfect example of maybe another interview session when we talk about women in leadership positions.
Yes.
So on that note, I'd like to thank you again very much, Rebecca. Good luck with all your forthcoming meeting. Good luck with APEC and implementing the agenda. And I'm looking forward to our next meeting in Singapore or Malaysia, or whenever you happen to fly over to Europe, let me know. I'll be happy to test your cooking skills.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. And bye-bye to Singapore.
Thank you. Thank you very much.